Hello historians and welcome back. Today we will be looking at the life of Lady Jane Grey. Again, because obviously this is the second video I've done on her. Lady Jane Grey is the woman who would be known incorrectly as the 9-Day Queen. How Jane's reign was handled over the years has always irritated me, and she should be referred to as Queen Jane I. And yet, we just insult her and her memory because we refer to her as the Lady Jane Grey. So today I'm going to be walking you through the 13 days, yes, the 13 days of Jane's reign. As I covered in the previous video, Jane was born on around October 1537 to Francis and Henry Grey. Through her father, Jane was the great-great-granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth Woodville, because Queen Elizabeth Woodville had 2 children from her previous marriage before she married the king, and Jane descends from one of those 2 children. And through her mother, she was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII. We learnt in the last episode that Jane had married Guildford Dudley, the son of the Duke of Norfolk. As King Edward VI lay dying, Northumberland steered the king into changing the line of succession, so his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, were skipped, and instead Northumberland's daughter-in-law and Edward's cousin Jane would conveniently be queen instead. King Edward VI died on the 6th of July 1553 at Greenwich Palace. Once a monarch has died, their successor starts their reign from then on, unless you're King Henry VII, where you're precocious enough to start the date of your reign as the day before the battle that actually got you the crown in the first place. But he's the exception, we ignore him. King Edward VI died on the 6th of July. Therefore, Jane's reign starts on the 6th of July, as the Privy Council knew prior to Edward's death who his successor would be, and that's how monarchy works. We saw the same recently with Queen Elizabeth II. She died on the 8th of September 2022, and Prince Charles became King Charles III upon her death on the 8th of September 2022. Despite the fact, as writing this, that the king hasn't had his coronation, he is still King Charles III, although his coronation, as the time of writing this, is actually going to be next month.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The palace has just issued this statement. It says the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening.
However, because history has a vendetta against Jane, her reign is always documented as the 10th of July 1553, 4 days later, which is where the 9-Day Queen comes from. But she did rule for 13 days, and there are so many boy kings in our history that did not have a coronation the same as Jane, and yet they are still referred to as king. And yes, this bugs me.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me. It bothers me. It bothers me a lot. And that one's still green!
Hashtag justice for Jane. Hashtag 13-Day Queen. I'm gonna start a YouTube revolution. You watch me. Oh my god, no, that sounds far too much work. Another snub is the fact that history remembers Jane as the Lady Jane Grey, not Queen Jane I, as she should be. However, she's not the only woman in history to face this prejudice. For example, Matilda, who should be the Empress Matilda or Queen Matilda I, also has the same issue. Hashtag Queen Jane I. 7th of July 1553, the day after Edward VI died, the Privy Council were very cautious, and they decided to hide the king's death from the public, as the country was vulnerable until a new monarch was secured. The Duke of Northumberland sent his son Robert Dudley the future favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, and 300 soldiers to capture the Lady Mary before she could gather support for her claim to the throne. As she was the main competitor for the throne, she had the best claim, and it was the wish of her father, King Henry VIII, for Mary to succeed Edward if he didn't have any children. However, Mary already knew, as she'd been informed by those who were loyal to her, and she had fled to one of her estates. The common folk, who still believed that Edward was alive, were sure that Northumberland was trying to poison Edward. I mean, they weren't wrong. The guy did literally pay someone to give Edward arsenic.
All right, it was an accident, I swear. Phoebe, tell her.
Okay, I didn't see it because I was putting on my jacket, but I want to believe you.
But Northumberland tried to discredit Mary, saying that the last time Mary visited her brother, she had cast an evil spell on him. Mary was very popular at the time, and hardly anyone believed these outlandish claims. Word was getting out that the king was dying, but as we know, he was already dead. The attendants propped Edward up against the window to try and make it look like he was still alive. But the public was shocked to see that Edward's skinny body was so swollen. His fingers were turning black, and his hair had fallen out.
Gross.
I don't care how far away that window was, but if somebody's fingers have turned black and they've lost their hair, I don't understand how they thought that was going to pass. On the 8th of July 1553, the Duke of Northumberland secured the waterway near the Tower of London, and he moved loyal Protestants across the country. The movement of the guards made it very obvious that the king had died, despite there being no official announcement, and Jane still had no idea that she was queen, or that she had been for the last 2 days. A bit like the rest of history. On Sunday the 9th of July 1553, Northumberland summons his daughter-in-law Lady Jane Grey to Syon Park House, the home of the Duke and Duchess of Northumberland. It is here that Jane was informed that she was now Queen of England. Jane expressed that it's not for her and that the rightful queen is Mary, a view that Jane was not alone in thinking. Reportedly, Jane cried, but this has been thought that she cried more for the death of her cousin the king, rather than her unwillingness to actually be queen. Jane's parents, Francis and Henry Grey, arrived at Syon House where they would pressure her into accepting the queenship. I'm assuming that the pressure came more from Henry, as Francis seemed to keep her nose clean later on, whereas Henry would quite literally die supporting his daughter's claim. Jane then acknowledges that it is God's will for her to be queen and accepts. Meanwhile, the Lady Mary wrote letters to influential landowners hoping that she would be able to get their support. On the 10th of July 1553, the day that is often attributed to the start of Jane's reign, Jane assumed the throne. She was proclaimed queen despite being fifth in line to the throne and ousting Edward's sisters, and Jane took a barge to the Tower of London. And many were shocked that her mother Frances Grey was carrying her daughter's train, as Frances had a better claim to the throne than Jane. But Jane was made queen through Northumberland's scheming, and Jane was married to his son, not Francis. Many had issue with Northumberland as he seemed confident and self-assured, and many saw Northumberland's plan to make his son king through Jane. I mean, it was
pretty obvious.
Jane was taken to the Tower, as it was England's stronghold, and it was believed that if you controlled the Tower, you controlled the power. Northumberland and the Privy Council rushed to secure the Tower of London, so Mary couldn't. The Tower of London at this point was a residency, a prison, and an armoury. Nobody rejoiced when Jane was announced by the heralds as queen, as was the case for new monarchs, but nobody dared to denounce her either. It was fairly neutral. I mean, one person did, but he had his ears nailed to a wall, and if he wanted to be set free, he had to repent, and the only way for him to be free was to have his ears chopped off. Northumberland was going to enforce Jane's reign through fear, and I bet you can guess how well that turned out. Interestingly enough, Jane was the first monarch to be announced through print. The publication was printed and handed out through the country. Edward's proclamation was a page long. Jane's proclamation was 3 pages long. The length of her proclamation compared to Edward's shows just how big of an uphill battle Jane was going to face in order to keep her queenship, as the proclamation justifies the line of succession. The Privy Council received a message from Mary to say support her cause and she will pardon them. But if you don't, you will face bloodshed. The Privy Council had a decision to make: abandon Jane or start a civil war. Mary also told the country that the religion of the country would not change much from her brother Edward's rule. This was obviously a lie just to gain support, which she would prove during her own reign. Submitting to Mary would also mean a loss of titles for most of the council. The council wrote a response to Mary and got Jane to sign the letter as Jane the Queen, a letter that would later be used as evidence for treason. The next day, on the 11th of July 1553, after the lack of enthusiasm of Jane's announcement as Queen, Northumberland sent people out into the streets to gather support, and an army. Mary, however, already had her army. The issue with Jane is, nobody knew who she was. Jane, although royalty, wasn't or hadn't been paraded to the public, nor did she frequent court as often as she probably needed to have done. So nobody knew who they were fighting for, nor did they really care. Whereas the Lady Mary had made public visits since she was a little girl. She frequented court regularly and was often seen out and about, which ultimately gave her the upper hand over Jane. While in the Tower of London alone, Jane tried on the crown to see what it felt like, what it would look like to be queen. When the Lord Treasurer asked Jane if he should have one made for Guildford Dudley, you know, the presumed king consort, Jane said no. Instead, Dudley would be made a duke and she would rule alone. Queen Elizabeth II actually made a similar decision when she became queen, creating Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, not king consort. This was a power play by both women, reminding the world that they are the one in charge, it's their throne by birthright, and in both cases, the husbands would have technically outranked their wives if they had been made king consorts. It was the same with Queen Anne and with Queen Victoria. The only queens in English history who have made their husbands king consorts were Queen Mary I and Queen Mary II. Mary I would have to get a prenup so her husband wouldn't assume the role of king after her death, and Mary II allowed her husband to rule after her. Guildford was furious that Jane would not make him king consort, and he played the only card he had. He withheld sex. For those of you that don't understand the significance of this, no sex means no baby. No baby means no heir. No heir means their rule is not secure. On the 12th of July, 1553, the Lady Mary is in East Anglia, as she owns land here and is gathering her support from the locals, with whom she is popular. You see, the monarchy didn't own an army, they relied on their subjects wanting to fight for them, which is why this fight for power is actually very much a popularity contest, that Mary is winning. But the monarch could buy an army if they wanted to, which Jane unfortunately had to do. She even offered double the normal wage, but that still wasn't enough to dwindle Mary's supporters. Northumberland underestimated the size of Mary's army, and as the best soldier that they had, he was chosen to lead the military charge against Mary. It was originally Jane's father, Henry Grey, that was chosen, but he was very inexperienced and quite frankly lazy. Henry VIII knew this, which is why Henry Grey never got a dukedom till the reign of the inexperienced Edward VI. Unfortunately, with Northumberland away from London, there were no good politicians left to keep hold of the tower. Some historians see this as the crucial mistake that saw the downfall of Jane's reign. Later that day, Mary arrives at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk with an army and a huge cheer of support upon her arrival. The 13th of July 1553 was the day when most of the lords and nobles that supported Jane started to defect to Mary. Those who worked for the lords and nobles wanted to support Mary and started to be defiant, and so the landlords and nobles who supported Jane turned their allegiance to Mary out of fear of losing their power over their tenants. The next day, Jane asked for an inventory list to be made of everything valuable in the monarch's possession. On the 15th of July, Northumberland arrives at Cambridge, waiting for the rest of the artillery to arrive and surround Mary. Bad weather had forced his navy to seek shelter at a tavern, where they encountered a Mary sympathiser. The navy men told the man that they hadn't been paid by Northumberland, and so he convinces them to change sides and fight for Mary. The Privy Council heard of the Navy's mutiny the next day, and London was getting ready for an attack from Mary. Jane locked herself and her nobles in the Tower of London, and she requested that the keys be given to her, to prevent any of them from jumping ship. If Jane was going to go down, she was going to take the men that put her in this position with her, because remember, Jane never wanted to be queen. As Jane predicted on the 17th of July, the men from the Privy Council were getting itchy feet and wanted to abandon Jane. Northumberland's artillery finally arrives, but he doesn't know about the Navy mutiny. But the Privy Council does, and they declare Northumberland as a traitor and Mary as queen. None the wiser, Northumberland continues to marry at Framlingham. He receives a letter telling him that Mary has more men, and now his navy, that he didn't pay for, is with her. Jane is abandoned by her uncle and the rest of the Privy Council. Jane then sets them free, with only her father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and her husband, Guildford Dudley, by her side. Jane's uncle, the Earl of Arundel, had backed Jane for monetary reasons, but as a Catholic abandoned Jane as soon as possible and used Northumberland as a scapegoat. When the Privy Council announced Mary as Queen in Cheapside, the street erupted in cheers of joy and bonfires were lit. Henry Grey removed the cloth of state from his daughter's head to show that she was no longer queen. Jane gave up the crown as readily as she has accepted it. She then turned to her father and said, "Can I go home now?" Jane was arrested and stripped of her valuables and placed in a small house on Tower Green. I think her asking to go home just shows how young and manipulated Jane was. We know that she was academically minded, but it also shows a young girl who doesn't understand the full extent of what she's just done. Jane has just usurped an heir. People have died for that. I mean, Jane ultimately would. I kind of feel like she was just a girl playing dress up or playing queen for a fortnight and was told, "You can't play this game anymore." And she's like, "Okay. I was getting bored anyway. It's not as fun as I thought it was." Jane's reign just shows the complexity of her character. You know, she makes these strong decisions like ruling alone and locking the Privy Council in with her because she knew they're not to be trusted. But then her immature words, like the ones just uttered, I don't know. Just let me know what you think about Jane in the comments below. The 19th of July, the Duke of Northumberland learnt that Mary was proclaimed queen. So to save his own skin, he cried. He had not been born as a higher up, and he had fought his way to the top, and he was so close to making Jane queen. On the night before his execution, he attended Catholic Mass in an attempt to save his life, but it didn't work. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was beheaded for treason on the 22nd of August 1553. Although I have seen some sources that claim he was hung, drawn and quartered, So I guess you can choose which method you prefer, because at the end of the day, they both achieve the same result. Mary enters London on the 3rd of August 1553 with her sister Elizabeth at her side, who was oddly quiet in all of this, but maybe that was for the best. Jane blamed Northumberland for her family's troubles. At the beginning of Queen Mary I's reign, Jane and her father were committed to the Tower of London, but Henry Grey was soon pardoned. Jane and her husband Guildford were charged with high treason on the 14th of November 1553. Jane pleaded guilty and was sentenced to death. Mary, who wasn't as heartless as what you may think, began to feel sorry for her young cousin, and remembered Jane was about 16, and Mary, as we have seen with how she interacts with her sister Elizabeth, has a maternal side, and so she briefly suspended Jane's execution. But then, you guys, we have Sir Henry Grey.
Hello there.
He comes in and he just ruins everything. He couldn't have left it alone. You know, Mary's pardoned him. She's, decided to pause Jane's execution. She signed the death warrant, but she's like, maybe we won't do that at the moment. And so, in early 1554, Mary announced her plans that she was going to marry Philip of Spain, which was a very unpopular match. And to be honest, even Philip wasn't that thrilled. Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion in the February known as the Wyatt Rebellion.
Real original.
Which sought to depose Mary and replace her with her sister Elizabeth. The issue was that Jane's father, Henry Grey, was heavily involved in this rebellion. Elizabeth was placed in the Tower and interrogated, and then released on lack of evidence. But Jane wasn't so lucky. Despite Jane not being named as a potential replacement for Mary, Henry, Jane's father, his involvement was enough to send them both to the chopping block. Mary had forgiven Sir Henry Grey once, and she wasn't so generous to do it a second time. On the 12th of February 1554, Jane watched her husband, Guildford Dudley, being carried away to be executed from the window of her cell in the Tower of London, and 2 hours later, she would be dead. Henry Grey and Guildford Dudley would receive public executions, although Henry's would be on the 23rd of February. Jane would have a private execution on Tower Green within the grounds of the castle. Between 1483 and 1941, there would be 22 executions at the Tower of London, which actually, when you think about it, isn't that lot, considering the amount of people that were executed between that time period. Jane was one of 5 women, and one of 3 queens, the other 2 being Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Jane didn't flinch at seeing her husband's body, and she wore the same black dress that she wore when she was proclaimed queen. Jane carried her prayer book with her to the scaffold and handed it over just before she knelt for her beheading. Jane had written some messages in her prayer book. One of them is a heartfelt message to her father. She writes, "The Lord comforts your grace, that the word wherein all creatures can only be comforted. And thou it hath pleased God to take away 2 of your children. Yet think not that you have lost them, but trust that we, by living this mortal life, have won an immortal life. Your Grace's humble daughter, Jane Dudley." It is said that Jane died bravely, asking the executioner to please dispatch me quickly. It is believed that she tied her handkerchief around her eyes and felt for the block, asking where is it, and that someone guided her to the block. But many historians are now starting to dismiss this as a myth, or a flat-out fabrication added to make Jane's tragic story even more so. There is one eyewitness account written at the time of her execution. All other sources were written years, decades, and even centuries after her execution. Jane did reportedly say on the scaffold that she is not guilty of ambition, which is true. She never did seek the crown, but equally she didn't refuse it. Also, let's talk about this infamous Delaroche painting that depicts Jane's execution, which probably inspired the myth about her fumbling hopelessly for the block. Do I think it's an accurate representation of what happened? No. I mean, if you don't have anything nice to say about something, then obviously you're better off not saying it, and that applies to everything, whether it's people, works of art, YouTube comments. So I will say something nice about the painting. He did a good job of the straw. I think he painted that very well, and I think there might have been straw at the execution. I cannot say anything else about the painting, because I just think it creates so many more problems. Jane's father, Sir Henry Grey, as I said, was executed on the 23rd of February 1554. His head fell into sawdust that was steeped in tanning. Because of this, his head was preserved like leather and was put on show until the 1940s. The head was then finally buried in London, about a mile away from his 400-year-old body. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. I would be interested to know in what you think about Jane in the comment section below. And if you fancy watching another video, why not watch my video on the early life of Lady Jane Grey? Or why not King Edward VI, and why he was so important to his father King Henry VIII? Next time, we will be exploring the early life of Queen Mary I. But until then, have a wonderful day.